The autumn rain of 1861 drummed against the carriage windows as Dr. Edmund Hartwell made his way through the muddy roads of Henrico County. The war had begun in earnest, and Richmond buzzed with Confederate preparations, but here in the Virginia countryside, an older darkness seemed to permeate the very soil. Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from ancient oaks, and the air carried the scent of decay that no amount of rain could wash away. Doctor. Hartwell adjusted his medical bag nervously as the carriage approached Randolph Manor. At 32, he had seen his share of disturbing cases in Richmond's hospitals, but the letter that had summoned him here carried an urgency that made his hands tremble. The Randolph family, one of Virginia's oldest bloodlines, had requested his immediate attention for their daughter, Miss Cordelia Randolph, who had fallen into what they described as a most peculiar malady. The mansion emerged from the mist like a Gothic nightmare. Once grand, the three-story colonial structure now showed signs of neglect that spoke of more than mere wartime hardship. Paint peeled from its columns, several windows were boarded shut, and the gardens had grown wild and untended. Most unsettling were the iron bars that had been installed on the ground floor windows, not to keep intruders out, but seemingly to keep something in. As the carriage wheels crunched on the gravel drive, Dr. Hartwell noticed movement in the slave quarters. Despite the late hour, figures moved about with an urgency that seemed almost frantic. A woman's voice carried on the wind, not a cry of pain, but something that sounded disturbingly like ecstasy. The front door opened before he could knock. A gaunt man in his 60s stood silhouetted against the dim interior light. This was Thaddeus Randolph, the family patriarch, whose hollow eyes and prematurely white hair gave him the appearance of a man who had seen too much. "Dr. Hartwell," Thaddeus said, his voice carrying the refined accent of Virginia aristocracy, tinged with something that might have been relief. "Thank Providence you've come. Cordelia's condition has worsened considerably since we sent word." The interior of the mansion was as disturbing as its exterior. Family portraits lined the walls, but many had been defaced or turned to face the wall. The air was thick with the smell of incense and something else, something organic and unsettling that made Dr. Hartwell's stomach turn. Candles provided the only illumination, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames. "Where is the patient, Doctor?" Hartwell asked, following Thaddeus up a grand staircase whose banister was carved with symbols he didn't recognize, intertwining figures that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. "In the east wing," Thaddeus replied, his footsteps echoing in the vast hallway. "But first, Doctor, I must prepare you for what you're about to see. Cordelia is... She has always been different. Special, you might say. The women of our family often are." They passed several closed doors behind which Dr. Hartwell could swear he heard whispered conversations and the occasional muffled cry. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, lined with more portraits of Randolph ancestors, all bearing the same pale complexion and dark, penetrating eyes that seemed to follow their movement. "The Randolph bloodline is ancient," Thaddeus continued, his voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality. "We trace our lineage back to the earliest settlers of Virginia. We have traditions, practices that ensure the purity of our line, the continuation of our gifts." Dr. Hartwell felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mansion's drafty corridors. "What sort of gifts, Mr. Randolph?" Thaddeus stopped before a heavy oak door, reinforced with iron bands. From within came the sound of chains rattling and a voice, unmistakably female, speaking in what sounded like Latin, though the words were too distorted to understand. "You'll see soon enough," Thaddeus said, producing an ornate key from his waistcoat. "But I must warn you, Doctor. What you witness here tonight must never leave these walls. The Randolph family has survived for centuries by maintaining certain discretions. As the key turned in the lock, Dr. Hartwell heard footsteps approaching from behind. He turned to see a woman in her 40s descending upon them, Thaddeus's wife, Evangeline Randolph. Her beauty was undeniable, but there was something predatory in her smile, something that made Dr. Hartwell instinctively step back. "Doctor," she purred, her voice carrying a slight accent that wasn't quite southern. "How good of you to come. Cordelia has been asking for you specifically, asking for me, but I've never met your daughter." Evangeline's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp. "Oh, but she knows you, Doctor. She knows all about you. Your work at the hospital, your particular interests in anatomy. She's quite excited to make your acquaintance." The door swung open, revealing a room that defied all expectations of a young lady's chamber. The walls were covered in strange symbols, painted in what appeared to be dried blood. Candles arranged in geometric patterns provided flickering illumination, and the air was thick with the smell of sulfur and something else, something that reminded Dr. Hartwell of the anatomy theater, where he had studied cadavers. In the center of the room, chained to a four-poster bed, was Cordelia Randolph. Dr. Hartwell had to grip the doorframe to steady himself. The young woman, she couldn't have been more than 20, was completely naked, her pale skin covered in intricate scarification that formed patterns similar to those on the walls. But it was her eyes that truly disturbed him. They were completely black, as if the pupils had expanded to consume the iris entirely. "Doctor," Cordelia said, her voice carrying an unnatural resonance that seemed to come from multiple throats. "I've been waiting for you. We have so much to discuss." As Dr. Hartwell stepped into the room, he noticed other details that made his medical training rebel against what he was seeing. Cordelia's body showed signs of recent trauma, not the kind that came from accident or disease, but deliberate markings that suggested ritualistic practices. Her wrists and ankles bore the marks of restraints, but the scarring was old, suggesting this was not her first time in chains. "What has been done to her?" Dr. Hartwell whispered, his professional instincts warring with a growing sense of horror. "Nothing that wasn't done willingly," Evangeline replied, moving to stand beside the bed. "Cordelia is special, Doctor. She carries the true blood of our family, the blood that connects us to powers older than this nation, older than Christianity itself." Cordelia's head turned toward her mother with a movement that was too fluid, too serpentine to be entirely human. "Mother speaks truly, Doctor. I am what our family has been breeding toward for generations, the perfect vessel for our patron's gifts." Dr. Hartwell's hands shook as he opened his medical bag. Whatever was happening here went far beyond any medical condition he had encountered, but his oath as a physician demanded he try to help. As he approached the bed, however, Cordelia's chains rattled and she spoke again. "Tell me, Doctor, have you ever wondered what lies beyond the boundaries of human experience? What pleasures and pains exist in the spaces between sanity and madness?" The room seemed to grow colder, and Dr. Hartwell realized that the symbols on the walls were not merely painted. They were carved into the very wood and stone, filled with a dark substance that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. As he looked closer, he saw that some of the symbols were moving, shifting and changing as if alive. "This is impossible," he muttered. But even as he spoke, he knew he was witnessing something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural world. Thaddeus placed a hand on his shoulder, and Dr. Hartwell was surprised by the strength in the older man's grip. "Nothing is impossible, Doctor, only improbable. And the Randolph family has spent generations making the improbable into reality." As the first chapter of his nightmare began, Dr. Hartwell realized that he had not been summoned to heal Cordelia Randolph. He'd been brought here to witness something far more sinister, something that would challenge not only his understanding of medicine, but his very conception of what it meant to be human. Dr. Hartwell spent the remainder of that first night in a guest chamber that felt more like a cell. The room was spartanly furnished, with a single window that looked out onto the slave quarters, where strange lights continued to flicker until dawn. Sleep eluded him as Cordelia's words echoed in his mind, and when morning finally came, he found himself questioning whether the previous night had been real or some fever dream brought on by the stress of wartime. His doubts were dispelled when a young slave girl brought him breakfast. The girl, who couldn't have been more than 16, moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to avoid drawing attention to herself. But it was her eyes that confirmed the reality of his situation. They held the hollow look of someone who had witnessed unspeakable things. "Master Thaddeus requests your presence in the library after you've eaten, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's your name, child?" Dr. Hartwell asked gently. The girl glanced nervously toward the door. "Mercy, sir, but please, you mustn't keep Master waiting. He doesn't like to be kept waiting." After she left, Dr. Hartwell noticed she had left behind more than just his breakfast. Hidden beneath the napkin was a small piece of paper with a message scrawled in desperate handwriting: "The cellar, tonight, after the bells." Before he could examine it further, footsteps in the hallway prompted him to quickly pocket the note. The library was a vast room, lined with books from floor to ceiling, but as Dr. Hartwell entered, he realized that many of the volumes were not the classical works one might expect in a Virginia gentleman's collection. Ancient tomes, bound in what appeared to be human skin, sat alongside medical texts and genealogical records. The air was thick with the smell of old parchment and something else, something that reminded him of the anatomy theater. Thaddeus sat behind a massive oak desk, surrounded by open books and yellowed documents. In the morning light, he appeared even more gaunt than he had the night before, his skin taking on an almost translucent quality that revealed the network of veins beneath. "Ah, doctor," Thaddeus said without looking up from his reading. "I trust you slept well?" "No, of course you didn't. Few do. Their first night in this house. The walls themselves seem to whisper of our family's history." "Doctor." Hartwell approached the desk cautiously. "Mr. Randolph, I must insist that we discuss your daughter's condition in medical terms. What I witnessed last night was the culmination of nearly 2 centuries of careful breeding and preparation," Thaddeus interrupted, finally raising his eyes to meet Dr. Hartwell's gaze. "Please sit. Let me tell you the true history of the Randolph family." "The chair, doctor." Hartwell was offered, faced a large portrait of a man in colonial dress whose resemblance to Thaddeus was unmistakable. The painted eyes seemed to follow him as he sat, and he noticed that the man's hands, folded in his lap, bore the same scarification patterns he had seen on Cordelia's skin. "That is Jeremiah Randolph, my great-great-grandfather," Thaddeus began, his voice taking on the cadence of a well-rehearsed story. "He arrived in Virginia in 1682, not as a settler seeking fortune, but as a man fleeing persecution in Salem. You see, doctor, Jeremiah was accused of witchcraft, an accusation that was, I'm proud to say, entirely accurate." Dr. Hartwell felt his rational mind rebelling against what he was hearing, but the evidence of his own eyes from the previous night made it impossible to dismiss entirely. Jeremiah brought with him knowledge that predated Christianity, practices that connected him to forces older than civilization itself. He established this plantation not merely as a source of wealth, but as a sanctuary where these ancient rites could be preserved and perfected. Thaddeus rose from his chair and moved to a bookshelf, retrieving a leather-bound volume that seemed to emanate cold despite the warmth of the room. This is Jeremiah's journal, written in his own hand. It details the first experiments in what he called bloodline purification, the systematic breeding of our family to produce individuals capable of serving as vessels for entities that exist beyond the veil of normal reality. "You're speaking of incest," Dr. Hartwell said bluntly, his medical training asserting itself. "The genetic consequences alone are precisely what we desired." Thaddeus replied with a smile that held no warmth. Each generation, we have carefully selected breeding pairs to concentrate certain traits, certain sensitivities. The madness that outsiders whisper about is not a flaw, Doctor. It is a feature. It opens doors in the mind that allow communion with beings of immense power. He opened the journal to a page covered in diagrams that made Dr. Hartwell's stomach turn. They showed human figures in various states of anatomical impossibility, connected by lines and symbols that hurt to look at directly. My grandfather, Ezekiel, refined Jeremiah's work, Thaddeus continued. He discovered that certain physical practices, when combined with the proper bloodline, could create permanent changes in human physiology, changes that allowed for experiences beyond the normal boundaries of pleasure and pain. Dr. Hartwell found himself drawn to the journal despite his revulsion. The diagrams were rendered with scientific precision, showing modifications to human anatomy that should have been fatal, but were presented as enhancements. This is impossible. The human body cannot survive such alterations. The normal human body, perhaps. But the Randolph bloodline has been shaped over generations to transcend such limitations. Thaddeus turned to another page, revealing detailed anatomical drawings of female reproductive systems that had been modified. Each woman in our family undergoes preparation from childhood. Their bodies are gradually adapted to serve as conduits for forces that would destroy an ordinary person. The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced Evangeline's arrival. She entered the library carrying a tea service, but Dr. Hartwell noticed that the liquid she poured was not tea. It was thick and dark, with an oily consistency that reflected the lamplight strangely. I see my husband is sharing our family's proud history, she said, offering Dr. Hartwell a cup. Please drink. It will help you understand. Dr. Hartwell hesitated, but Evangeline's smile carried an implicit threat. The liquid was bitter and left a metallic aftertaste that reminded him of blood. Almost immediately, he felt a strange clarity descend upon his mind, as if veils were being lifted from his perception. Better? Evangeline asked, settling into a chair beside her husband. Now you can see us as we truly are. Dr. Hartwell gasped as his enhanced vision revealed details that had been hidden before. Evangeline's beauty was still present, but now he could see the subtle wrongness beneath, the way her joints bent at slightly unnatural angles, the pattern of scars that covered her arms like ritual markings, the fact that her shadow seemed to move independently of her body. Evangeline is not originally a Randolph, Thaddeus explained. She was brought to us from Louisiana, where her family practiced similar traditions. Our marriage was arranged to introduce new bloodlines while maintaining the essential characteristics we have cultivated. The Creole families of New Orleans understand things that the Protestant settlers never could, Evangeline added, her accent becoming more pronounced. We brought knowledge of how to bind spirits to flesh, how to make the body a temple for entities that hunger for physical experience. Dr. Hartwell tried to stand, but found his limbs heavy and unresponsive. The drug in the liquid was taking effect, making it difficult to think clearly. What do you want from me? Your expertise, Thaddeus replied. You see, Doctor, our practices have reached a critical juncture. Cordelia represents the culmination of our breeding program, but her transformation requires medical knowledge that we lack. We need someone who understands human anatomy to help us complete her metamorphosis. Metamorphosis? Into what? Evangeline leaned forward, her eyes reflecting light like an animal's, into something that can survive what we have planned for her. You see, Doctor, our patron grows impatient. It has waited centuries for a vessel capable of housing its full essence, and Cordelia is nearly ready, but the final preparations require surgical precision. The room began to spin as the drug took full effect, and Dr. Hartwell realized that he had not been brought here as a physician. He had been brought here as an accomplice. As consciousness faded, he heard Thaddeus's voice, as if from a great distance. "Rest now, Doctor. Tonight, you will witness the true purpose of the Randolph family, and tomorrow you will help us achieve our destiny." Dr. Hartwell awoke to the sound of distant screaming. The drug had left him disoriented and nauseous, but the terror in those cries cut through his mental fog like a blade. Moonlight streamed through his window, and he realized that night had fallen while he lay unconscious. The note from the slave girl, Mercy, crinkled in his pocket as he struggled to his feet. The mansion was different at night. The shadows seemed deeper, more alive, and the very walls appeared to pulse with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. As he made his way through the corridors, following the sound of what he now recognized as church bells tolling midnight, he noticed details that had escaped his attention before. The floorboards were stained with dark patches that no amount of cleaning could remove, and the air carried the persistent smell of sulfur and decay. The screaming had stopped, replaced by a low chanting that seemed to come from beneath the house. "Doctor." Hartwell followed the sound, his medical bag clutched tightly in his hand, though he suspected that conventional medicine would be useless against whatever he was about to encounter. He found the entrance to the cellar hidden behind a tapestry depicting scenes from classical mythology, or what he had initially taken for mythology. Looking closer, he realized the figures were engaged in acts that no civilized artist would dare portray, their bodies intertwined in ways that defied both anatomy and decency. The stone steps leading downward were worn smooth by centuries of use, and the walls were carved with the same symbols he had seen in Cordelia's room. But here, they were older, deeper, and seemed to writhe in the flickering torchlight that illuminated the passage. As he descended, the chanting grew louder, and he began to make out individual voices. Thaddeus and Evangeline were there, but so were others. Voices he didn't recognize, speaking in languages that predated English. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy with incense and something else that made his eyes water. The cellar opened into a vast chamber that couldn't possibly fit within the foundation of the house above. The ceiling disappeared into darkness, supported by pillars carved from what appeared to be a single piece of black stone. Torches arranged in geometric patterns provided the only light, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames. In the center of the chamber stood an altar made from the same black stone as the pillars. Upon it lay a figure that Dr. Hartwell initially took for Cordelia. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he realized his mistake. This was another young woman, perhaps 18 or 19, with the same pale skin and dark hair that seemed to characterize the Randolph bloodline. Around the altar stood a circle of figures in dark robes, their faces hidden by masks that bore no resemblance to any human features. The chanting came from them, a rhythmic incantation that seemed to make the very air vibrate. At the head of the altar stood Thaddeus and Evangeline, both naked and covered in the same scarification patterns that marked their daughter. Dr. Hartwell pressed himself against a pillar, trying to remain hidden while observing the ritual. The young woman on the altar was conscious but restrained by chains that seemed to be made of the same black material as the stone. Her eyes were wide with terror, but her mouth was gagged, preventing her from crying out. "The bloodline is pure," Thaddeus intoned, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to come from something beyond himself. "The vessel is prepared. Let the ancient compact be fulfilled." Evangeline raised a curved blade that gleamed with an oily sheen in the torchlight. "By blood and pain, by pleasure and torment, we open the way for our patron's return." Dr. Hartwell wanted to intervene, but his body seemed frozen by the same force that made the air thick and oppressive. He could only watch in horror as the ritual continued, the chanting growing louder and more frenzied with each passing moment. The blade descended, but instead of ending the young woman's life, it began to carve symbols into her flesh with surgical precision. The cuts were deep but somehow non-fatal, following patterns that seemed to channel the blood flow in specific directions. The woman's muffled screams filled the chamber, but there was something else in her voice, something that might have been ecstasy mixed with the agony. As the scarification continued, Dr. Hartwell noticed changes in the young woman's body that defied medical explanation. Her skin began to take on a luminescent quality, and the symbols carved into her flesh started to glow with their own inner light. Her struggles against the chains became more violent, but also more rhythmic, as if she were responding to some unheard music. "The transformation begins," one of the masked figures announced, in a voice that seemed to come from multiple throats. "The flesh accepts the mark of our patron." Dr. Hartwell felt a hand on his shoulder and spun around to find Mercy standing behind him, her young face etched with a terror that spoke of years of witnessing such horrors. "You came," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the chanting. "I wasn't sure you would." "What is this?" Dr. Hartwell asked, though part of him already knew the answer would be something his rational mind would refuse to accept. "They call it the binding," Mercy replied, pulling him deeper into the shadows. "They've been doing it for generations, preparing vessels for something they call the patron, the young woman on the altar. That's Sarah, Cordelia's cousin. She's been chosen for the preliminary ritual." "Preliminary to what?" Mercy's eyes filled with tears. "To Cordelia's final transformation. Sarah is just practice, a way to ensure the ritual will work when they perform it on someone who truly carries the concentrated bloodline." On the altar, Sarah's transformation was accelerating. Her body was changing in ways that should have been impossible, her limbs elongating, her joints bending at new angles, her very skeleton seeming to reshape itself to accommodate whatever was being summoned into her flesh. "How long has this been happening?" Dr. Hartwell asked, his medical training struggling to process what he was witnessing. "Since the family first came to Virginia," Mercy replied. "My grandmother told me stories passed down from the first slaves brought to this plantation. They've always known what the Randolphs really are, but speaking of it meant death." The chanting reached a crescendo, and the air in the chamber began to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Dr. Hartwell felt a pressure in his head, as if something vast and alien was pressing against the boundaries of reality, seeking entry into the physical world. Sarah's screams had changed, becoming something that was no longer entirely human. Her body convulsed on the altar, but the movements were too fluid, too serpentine to be natural. When she opened her eyes, they were completely black, just like Cordelia's had been. "It is done," Thaddeus announced, his voice filled with satisfaction. "The vessel accepts our patron's essence. Sarah will serve as a conduit until Cordelia is ready for the full transformation." Evangeline approached the altar with a goblet made from what appeared to be carved bone. She held it beneath one of Sarah's wounds, collecting the luminescent blood that flowed from the scarification. "The blood of the transformed will prepare Cordelia's body for what is to come." Dr. Hartwell realized with growing horror that he was witnessing not just a ritual, but a systematic process that had been refined over generations. The Randolph family had turned their own bloodline into a breeding program designed to produce vessels for entities that existed beyond human understanding. "We have to stop this," he whispered to Mercy, but she shook her head sadly. "There's no stopping it, Doctor. It's been building for too long, gone too far. All we can do is try to save who we can." As if summoned by their whispered conversation, one of the masked figures turned toward their hiding place. Dr. Hartwell caught a glimpse of what lay beneath the mask. Not a human face, but something that might once have been human before undergoing the same transformation he had just witnessed. "We have visitors," the thing announced in its multi-toned voice. "The physician awakens to witness our glory." Thaddeus smiled, his teeth gleaming in the torchlight. "Dr. Hartwell, how good of you to join us. I was hoping you would be conscious for this part of the evening's entertainment." As the robed figures began to move toward them, Dr. Hartwell realized that his role in this nightmare was far from over. The Randolph family had not brought him here merely to witness their rituals. They had brought him here to participate in them. Dr. Hartwell found himself dragged from the shadows by hands that felt wrong, too cold, too strong, with joints that bent in directions human fingers should not bend. The masked figures that surrounded him moved with an unnatural grace, their robes rustling with sounds that reminded him of scales sliding across stone. "Doctor," Thaddeus said, approaching with the same casual manner he might use to greet a guest at a dinner party, "I apologize for the deception, but it was necessary. You see, what we require of you cannot be accomplished through coercion alone. It requires willing participation." Dr. Hartwell struggled against his captors, but their grip was implacable. On the altar, Sarah's transformation continued, her body now bearing only a passing resemblance to human anatomy. Her limbs had elongated to impossible proportions, and her skin had taken on a translucent quality that revealed the dark fluid flowing through her veins. "What you're doing is an abomination," Dr. Hartwell said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "This goes against everything medicine stands for, the preservation of human life, the alleviation of suffering." Evangeline laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Suffering, Doctor? Look at Sarah's face. Does she appear to be suffering?" "Doctor." Hartwell was forced to admit that Sarah's expression, while no longer entirely human, showed no signs of pain. Instead, there was something that might have been rapture, a transcendent joy that spoke of experiences beyond normal human comprehension. "The transformation is not a punishment," Thaddeus explained, moving to stand beside the altar. "It is an elevation, a transcendence of the limitations that bind ordinary mortals. Sarah has become something greater than human, a bridge between our world and realms of infinite possibility." "And what does this have to do with me?" Dr. Hartwell demanded, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Cordelia's transformation will be far more complex than Sarah's," Evangeline replied, producing a set of surgical instruments from beneath her robes. "She is destined to become not merely a conduit, but a permanent vessel for our patron's consciousness. This requires surgical precision that only a trained physician can provide." The instruments were unlike anything Dr. Hartwell had seen in his medical training. They were crafted from the same black material as the altar and pillars, but their edges gleamed with an inner light that hurt to look at directly. The shapes were wrong, designed for procedures that no earthly anatomy could accommodate. "I will not be party to this madness," Dr. Hartwell said. But even as he spoke, he felt his resolve wavering. The drug they had given him earlier was still affecting his perception, making it difficult to distinguish between reality and nightmare. "Oh, but you will," Thaddeus said with certainty. "You see, Doctor, we have something that will ensure your cooperation." At his signal, two more figures emerged from the shadows, dragging a struggling form between them. "Doctor." Hartwell's heart sank as he recognized Mercy, the young slave girl who had tried to warn him. Her eyes were wide with terror and her mouth was gagged to prevent her from crying out. "The choice is simple," Evangeline said, pressing one of the alien surgical instruments against Mercy's throat. "You can assist us in Cordelia's transformation, or we can use this child for our preliminary experiments. I assure you, her death will be far less pleasant than Sarah's elevation, Doctor." Hartwell felt the weight of his medical oath pressing down upon him. He had sworn to do no harm, but how could he choose between participating in an abomination and allowing an innocent to suffer? The ethical calculus was impossible, designed to break his will and force his compliance. "What exactly would you require of me?" he asked, hating himself for even considering their proposal. Thaddeus smiled, recognizing the first crack in Dr. Hartwell's resistance. "Cordelia's body must be prepared to house an entity of immense power. This requires modifications to her anatomy that go beyond what our traditional methods can accomplish. We need someone with knowledge of human physiology to ensure that the changes are sustainable. The procedures we have in mind, Evangeline added, will push the boundaries of what the human form can endure. Without proper medical supervision, Cordelia might not survive the transformation, and our patron would be most displeased. Dr. Hartwell looked at Sarah on the altar, her transformed body writhing in what appeared to be ecstasy. Whatever had been done to her, she was clearly no longer human in any meaningful sense. The thought of performing similar procedures on another person filled him with revulsion. But the alternative, watching Mercy die, was equally unthinkable. "If I agree," he said slowly, "what guarantee do I have that you'll release the girl?" "None whatsoever," Thaddeus replied with brutal honesty. "But I can promise you that her death will be quick and painless if you cooperate, whereas refusal will result in her experiencing the full extent of our patron's hunger for suffering." The chamber fell silent, except for the sound of Sarah's rhythmic breathing and the distant dripping of water somewhere in the darkness. "Doctor." Hartwell felt the weight of the decision pressing down upon him, knowing that whatever choice he made would damn his soul. "There is another consideration," Evangeline said, her voice taking on a hypnotic quality. "The knowledge we offer goes far beyond anything taught in your medical schools. We can show you secrets of anatomy and physiology that will revolutionize your understanding of the human form. Think of the advances you could make, the lives you could save with such knowledge, Doctor." Hartwell felt his resolve wavering further. The rational part of his mind recognized this as manipulation, but the drug in his system made it difficult to think clearly. The promise of medical knowledge was seductive, especially when combined with the threat to Mercy's life. "Show me," he said finally, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. "Show me what you want me to do." Thaddeus nodded to one of the masked figures who produced a leather-bound tome similar to the one Dr. Hartwell had seen in the library. This volume, however, was clearly much older, its pages made from some material that was definitely not paper. "This is the Anatomica Transcendentis," Thaddeus explained, opening the book to reveal diagrams that made Dr. Hartwell's medical training rebel against what he was seeing. It contains detailed instructions for modifying human anatomy to accommodate non-human consciousness. The procedures described within have been refined over centuries of experimentation. The diagrams showed human bodies that had been systematically altered, their organs rearranged and modified to serve purposes that no earthly anatomy required. But what disturbed Dr. Hartwell most was the clinical precision of the illustrations. Whoever had created these procedures had possessed a deep understanding of human physiology. "These modifications," he said, studying the diagrams with growing horror, "they would require the subject to remain conscious throughout the procedure. The pain would be unimaginable." "Pain is merely another sensation," Evangeline replied. "And for those who carry the Randolph bloodline, pain and pleasure are often indistinguishable. Cordelia has been prepared for this her entire life. Her body will welcome the transformation." "Doctor." Hartwell thought of Cordelia chained in her room, her scarified flesh and inhuman eyes. Had she truly been prepared for this, or was she simply another victim of her family's madness? "When?" he asked, knowing that his acquiescence was inevitable. "Tomorrow night," Thaddeus replied. "The conjunction of celestial forces will be optimal, and our patron grows impatient. Too long have we promised a suitable vessel. The time for fulfillment has come." As if to emphasize the point, Sarah's body convulsed on the altar, and she spoke in a voice that was no longer her own. "The faithful shall be rewarded. The vessel shall be prepared. The ancient compact shall be fulfilled." Dr. Hartwell realized that he was no longer looking at Sarah, but at something that wore her transformed flesh like a garment. The entity that spoke through her was ancient and alien, its consciousness pressing against the boundaries of human perception. "You see," Thaddeus said with satisfaction, "the transformation is successful. Tomorrow night, Cordelia will become something far greater, a permanent home for our patron's full consciousness. As the masked figures began to disperse and the torches were extinguished one by one, Dr. Hartwell found himself alone with his terrible knowledge. He had agreed to participate in an abomination, but perhaps there was still time to find another way, a way to save both Mercy and Cordelia from the fate that awaited them. But as he was escorted back to his room, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was already too late, that the forces he had witnessed were too powerful to be stopped by one man's conscience. The Randolph family had spent generations preparing for this moment, and tomorrow night, their dark legacy would reach its culmination. The day of Cordelia's transformation dawned grey and oppressive, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like harbingers of the darkness to come. Dr. Hartwell spent the morning studying the Anatomica Transcendentis, his medical training warring with his conscience as he absorbed the horrific procedures detailed within its pages. The book was a masterwork of surgical knowledge, twisted to serve inhuman purposes. Each diagram showed modifications that would fundamentally alter human anatomy while keeping the subject alive and conscious. The precision required was extraordinary. A single mistake would result in death, but success would create something that was no longer human in any meaningful sense. As afternoon approached, Dr. Hartwell was summoned to Cordelia's room to begin the preliminary preparations. He found her exactly as he had left her, chained to the bed and covered in scarification, but there was something different about her demeanor. Where before there had been an alien intelligence behind her black eyes, now there was something that might have been anticipation. "Doctor," she said as he entered, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in his bones. "I have been dreaming of you, such wonderful dreams, full of cutting and reshaping and the ecstasy of transformation." Evangeline was already present, arranging surgical instruments on a table beside the bed. The alien tools gleamed with their inner light, and Dr. Hartwell noticed that some of them were moving slightly, as if possessed of their own life. "Cordelia has been fasting for 3 days," Evangeline explained. "Her body is purified and ready for the modifications. The scarification you see has prepared her flesh to accept the changes that are to come." Dr. Hartwell approached the bed cautiously, his medical bag feeling inadequate in the face of what he was being asked to do. "The procedures described in that book, they're impossible. The human body cannot survive such extensive modifications." "The normal human body, perhaps," Cordelia said, her chains rattling as she turned to face him. "But I am not normal, Doctor. I am the culmination of generations of careful breeding, of bloodlines refined to serve a specific purpose. My body has been shaped from birth to accommodate what is to come." As if to demonstrate her point, Cordelia's flesh began to change before his eyes. The scarification patterns started to glow with the same inner light he had seen in Sarah, and her skin took on a translucent quality that revealed the dark fluid flowing through her veins. Her bones seemed to shift and realign themselves, preparing for modifications that would have killed an ordinary person. "You see," Evangeline said with satisfaction, "the Randolph bloodline has been bred for this moment. Cordelia's body will welcome the transformation, will reshape itself to accommodate our patron's consciousness." Thaddeus entered the room carrying a goblet filled with the same luminescent blood Dr. Hartwell had seen collected from Sarah. "The preliminary vessel has served her purpose," he announced. "Sarah's essence has been distilled to create the catalyst that will enable Cordelia's complete transformation." Dr. Hartwell felt sick as he realized what they were asking him to do. The procedures in the book required the subject to consume the transformed blood of another vessel, creating a chain of corruption that linked each generation to the next. "I won't do this," he said, backing toward the door. "I won't be party to this abomination." But as he reached for the handle, he found his way blocked by two of the masked figures from the previous night. Their presence filled the room with an oppressive weight that made it difficult to breathe, and their multi-toned voices spoke in unison. The physician will fulfill his purpose. The vessel must be prepared. The ancient compact demands completion. Evangeline moved to stand beside Dr. Hartwell, her beauty now revealed as something predatory and inhuman. "You have already made your choice, Doctor. The girl's life hangs in the balance, and our patron grows impatient." As if summoned by her words, Mercy was brought into the room, her hands bound and her mouth gagged. Her eyes were wide with terror, but there was also something else, a desperate hope that Dr. Hartwell might still find a way to save her. "The choice remains the same," Thaddeus said, offering Dr. Hartwell one of the alien surgical instruments. "Participate willingly, and the girl dies quickly. Refuse, and she will experience the full extent of our patron's hunger for suffering." Dr. Hartwell took the instrument, its surface cold against his palm despite the warmth of the room. The blade seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, and he could feel something alien pressing against his consciousness, trying to guide his hand. "What exactly do you want me to do?" he asked, though he already knew the answer would be something that would damn his soul. "The procedures are clearly outlined in the Anatomica," Evangeline replied, opening the book to a page that showed a human torso opened and rearranged in ways that defied anatomy. "You must modify Cordelia's internal structure to create space for our patron's consciousness while maintaining the functions necessary for life, Doctor." Hartwell studied the diagram with growing horror. The procedure would require him to remove and relocate several vital organs, creating cavities within Cordelia's body that could house an alien intelligence. The precision required was extraordinary, but the book provided detailed instructions for keeping the subject alive throughout the process. "This is madness," he whispered, but even as he spoke, he felt his hands beginning to move of their own accord. The alien instrument seemed to guide his movements, drawing him toward the bed where Cordelia waited. "Madness is merely another word for transcendence," Cordelia said, her voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to come from multiple throats. "I have been waiting my entire life for this moment, Doctor. Do not deny me my destiny." As Dr. Hartwell approached the bed, he noticed that Cordelia's body was continuing to change. Her ribcage was expanding, creating space for the modifications that were to come, and her skin had become so translucent that he could see her organs shifting and rearranging themselves in preparation for the surgery. "The bloodline has prepared her well," Thaddeus observed with satisfaction. "Her body knows what is required and adapts accordingly. Your role is simply to guide the process with surgical precision, Doctor." Hartwell raised the alien blade, its edge gleaming with an inner light that hurt to look at directly. As he prepared to make the first incision, he caught sight of Mercy's terrified face and felt his resolve crumble. Whatever choice he made would result in horror, but at least this way, one innocent might be spared. The blade descended and Cordelia's flesh parted like water. But instead of blood, a luminescent fluid flowed from the wound, and Cordelia's expression showed not pain, but ecstasy. Her body welcomed the modification, reshaping itself to accommodate the changes that were being made. As the surgery continued, Dr. Hartwell felt his consciousness being drawn into something vast and alien. The entity that the Randolph family served was ancient beyond human comprehension, a being that existed in the spaces between reality and nightmare. It had been waiting centuries for a suitable vessel, and now that vessel was being prepared with surgical precision. "Excellent work, Doctor," Evangeline said as the procedure neared completion. "Cordelia's body is ready to receive our patron's full consciousness." But as Dr. Hartwell made the final modifications, he realized that something had gone wrong. The entity, pressing against the boundaries of reality, was not content to simply inhabit Cordelia's transformed flesh. It wanted more. It wanted to spread, to corrupt, to transform the entire world into something that reflected its alien nature. "This isn't what you promised," Dr. Hartwell said, backing away from the bed as Cordelia's transformation accelerated beyond what the book had described. "You said she would be a vessel, not a gateway. Thaddeus smiled, his face now showing the same inhuman characteristics that marked his daughter. Did we? How careless of us to omit certain details. You see, Doctor, our patron has grown tired of working through limited vessels. It desires a permanent foothold in our reality, and Cordelia will provide exactly that. The room began to shake as something vast and terrible pressed against the boundaries of the physical world. Cordelia's body was changing in ways that went beyond the modifications Dr. Hartwell had made, becoming something that could serve as an anchor for an entity of immense power. The ancient compact is fulfilled, the masked figures chanted in unison. The gateway opens, the patron comes. Doctor. Hartwell realized with growing horror that he had not been brought here to perform surgery. He had been brought here to midwife the birth of something that would consume everything he held dear. The Randolph family's dark legacy was about to reach its culmination, and he had played an essential role in making it possible. As Cordelia's transformation reached its climax and something alien began to pour through the gateway her body had become, Doctor. Hartwell understood that the true horror was not what had been done to the Randolph family over the generations. It was what they were about to unleash upon the world. The storm that had been gathering all day finally broke, and as lightning illuminated the Virginia countryside, the last barriers between reality and nightmare began to crumble. The most horrific sexual practices of the Randolph family had been revealed not as mere perversion, but as a systematic corruption of human nature designed to serve purposes that no mortal mind could fully comprehend. And in that moment of terrible revelation, Dr. Edmund Hartwell realized that he had become not a healer, but an instrument of humanity's damnation.